back. We go from man-made financial disaster to nature-made catastrophic disaster. It's not overloading the term. So remember when we talked on the first class about the San Siro hurricane, which was really bad, and how pretty much the government at the time, which was the sort of shy establishment of the colonial government because it was 1898, dealt with it really with donations from the mainland instead of any sort of coordinated government response. Maria was really the follow-up of the San Siro hurricane. The worst natural disaster on record to affect both Dominica and Puerto Rico, the 10th most intense Atlantic hurricane on record, and the most intense tropical cyclone worldwide of 2017. Maria was the 13th named storm that year, 8th consecutive hurricane, 4th major hurricane, 2nd Category 5 hurricane, and the deadliest storm of the hyperactive season of 2017. At its peak, the hurricane caused catastrophic damage and numerous fatalities across the northeastern Caribbean, compounding recovery efforts in the areas of the Leeward Islands that had already been struck by Hurricane Irma. Maria was the 3rd consecutive major hurricane to threaten the Leeward Islands in 2 weeks after Irma had made landfall in several of the islands 2 weeks prior, and Hurricane Jose passed dangerously close shortly afterwards, bringing tropical storm force winds to Barbuda. So in a period of 3 weeks, the Caribbean was getting hit with one storm after another after another. The hurricane reached Category 5 strength on September 18th, just before making landfall in Dominica, becoming the first Category 5 hurricane on record to strike the island. After weakening slightly due to crossing Dominica, Maria achieved its peak intensity over the eastern Caribbean with maximum sustained winds of 175,000 miles an hour. 175 miles an hour, sorry. It's like 75,000. Too much caffeine, making it the 10th most intense Atlantic hurricane on record. On September 20, an eye wall replacement cycle took place, weakening Maria to a high-end Category 4 hurricane by the time it struck Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico suffered catastrophic damage and a major humanitarian crisis, including the destruction of the already, as I mentioned, damaged electrical grid. For weeks in Maria's wakes, most of the island population suffered from flooding and lack of resources, compounded by the very slow relief process. Total losses from the hurricane are estimated to be upwards of 91 billion, and this is at the end of 2017, that was the estimate. It's much higher now. Mostly in Puerto Rico, ranking it as the 3rd costliest tropical cyclone on record. This is from ABC News right after, yes?
What about Katrina? Was it similar? They're both Category 5 and they both were catastrophic.
They were both catastrophic. And although the response was delayed in Katrina, the full force of FEMA at a certain point began to operate. In Puerto Rico, FEMA was short-handed because Houston and Miami had taken priority because they had happened before. So they were well-staffed in Houston and well-staffed in Miami. By the time you got to Puerto Rico, they had no staff, no resources on the island, and the problem with the Jones Act, which wouldn't allow ships that didn't have a U.S. flag to bring aid into Puerto Rico, right? Which wasn't waived until 2 weeks later, I think, or maybe 3. There are 2 levels of response, really, at the local level and the federal level. At the local level, there were a lot of problems simply because there were no resources. This has to do with the austerity program. There were just no resources. no resources to pull up the electric grid from scratch, really, because it was all destroyed. FEMA is supposed to have in storage in these places resources for this kind of emergency. The resources had already been pulled out of Puerto Rico towards the U.S. Virgin Islands because of a previous hurricane. So there were no tarps, there was no water, there was nothing on the island, right? And there had been little planning from FEMA about how to deliver the services that they needed to deliver, the food that they needed to deliver, and who to contract to create a new electric grid that wouldn't improve on the electric grid, because the Corps of Engineers, that's not their job, right? So they really were they were sort of learning new things that they had to do, had to contract out, ended up contracting companies that didn't have any background on doing this. There were lack of resources, lack of personnel, both because resources and personnel had already been used in the two previous hurricanes that happened in the 2-3 weeks before. If you look at the documentary, at the Frontline documentary, also the people who were sent to Puerto Rico they were trainees, had almost absolutely no training. Part of this was that in the budget, in the federal government's budget the previous year, the money that had been allocated was less than it had been allocated before, and it happened to be the year where they needed more money. So it was less money than generally you needed by FEMA, plus extra need because of the many occurrences of destructive hurricanes. Lack of planning of really how to deal with a crisis of this level in Puerto Rico. It's not the same to go to Houston, to go to Miami, than to go to an island, right, where you need to bring all the stuff in. And again, the Jones Act. So Houston could have received aid from other places if they wanted. Puerto Rico couldn't, because all the ships had to have a U.S. flag or come from the U.S. Lack of prioritizing after Houston and Florida. As I said, problems at the federal level and at the local level in terms of planning and coordinating, and how different aspects of the law created these issues. As I said, the Jones Act, FEMA rules about who to award a contract, how long it takes them to do the contract, the planning, the meeting, getting there on the ground, who was in charge of what part of the reconstruction, the kind of food that they could give people. Usually the stuff that they were given in general it was junk food, really, and soda pop. And Promesa, which had already hampered the local government because of austerity cuts. There were a ton of NGOs that stepped in for the federal government to try and plug the holes of the planning. Probably the most famous person is somebody who's local, is Chef Jose Andres, who virtually all by himself began to feed Puerto Rico that weekend with his credit card. I mean, it really is an incredible story. He just showed up and started feeding people. What was interesting, and I'll send you a couple of other videos, he wasn't the only person who was on the ground trying to do this. There were a bunch of people, either people who had experience in refugee crisis or people who had experience in war zones, people whose experience of deploying in crisis situations weren't exactly the same as what was happening in Puerto Rico, but their expertise was pertinent because it was like a war zone. There was no electricity, there was no water, there were no communication, people were sick. For example, if you finish listening to Jose Andres, the National Guard wasn't being fed. So he began to feed the National Guard, and in exchange, the National Guard would take food that he prepared to wherever they went to map out for FEMA things. So this wasn't coordinated with FEMA. He did it by himself. Later, FEMA paid him to continue doing it. And he did it, I think, for until the end of the year. He was the person who continued feeding Puerto Ricans all that time. And I mean, it really was a situation in which there was so little, there was a disconnect between what FEMA, the model that FEMA had in mind and what was needed on the ground. And it took them about 2 or 3 weeks to figure out what was needed. And in those 2 or 3 weeks, the people who were on the ground for their own reasons were the ones who plugged in those holes, right? Another side effect, of course, of Maria, as I mentioned before, is that all this medical production stopped, right? There was no electricity, there was no water, the roads were blocked. Although 3 months in, most of the production facilities were electrified, either because electricity had been reconnected to them or because they were running on generators. They're still, even today, where they say 93% of the country is electrified now, or 95%, it's not constant electricity. Every day you might have a blackout that is, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 5 hours. So if you are lucky enough to have electricity, you can't necessarily buy food, plan ahead how to feed your family, because the refrigerator might not have electricity for a few days, and then you'll lose all that food, right? You have to live day to day. This is a constant for the people of Puerto Rico right now. As I said before, the solution for this shortage of medication and medical products was for the FDA to simply relax their standards of where they bought the medications and the goods from, and that's how they made up the shortage coming from the Puerto Rico production line. I'll get to that in a minute. Another thing that is interesting, if you saw the Blackout documentary, is the interview with the person, the FEMA person who's in charge, who is now in Puerto Rico in charge of overseeing the reconstruction effort. Every time there is this project from the Corps of Engineers, the Blue Tarp project, which is to put tarps on top of roofs that are still leaking, they can't be fixed right away. And those blue tarps were distributed in a very efficient manner in Houston and Miami. In the same period of time, let's say that they distributed, 50,000 in Miami and 70,000 in Houston. In Puerto Rico, they had distributed 400. So when the FEMA director is confronted with this, it turns out that they hired 4 different companies for the tarps. Millions of dollar contracts. The first company they hired had never done this kind of work, and 2 weeks later there were no tarps. So they hired another company that also had no background in doing any sort of emergency relief. Finally, after many tries, they finally got a company that began to import the tarps. Except it happened that according to FEMA contracting rules, it cannot be imported tarps, right? And the reason that the last company was able to bring the tarps was because they were importing them from China, at which point they had to cancel that contract also. But I mean, this is just an example of the kind of, when he's confronted with this, like, we followed the rules for bidding for the contract, we didn't break the law. But obviously, if you are contracting a company that has never had any experience doing this, you are going to have a problem. Number two, the people that were contracted to rebuild the electric grid, the local company, the local electric company hired a company called Starfish, I think it was called, from Montana. That, I don't know, it was a 3-person company. They got a multi-million-dollar contract. They didn't know what they were doing either. In the end, the Corps of Engineers decided it was the one who started doing it, but they also had no background in doing exactly this kind of work, so they contracted a different company. I mean, every story of every step of trying to fix this was a story of reinventing the wheel at every step of the process, instead of having, like in Houston or in Miami, set operating procedures that would actually that we know function, because this is not new. We've done this before, right? But for some reason, confronted with the Puerto Rican reality, which is perhaps not the same reality as one in the rest of the country, they decided to reinvent the wheel. And confronted with that, they just had one problem after another. It is true that given the disrepair of the electric grid in Puerto Rico and the topography and really the degree of destruction in the vegetation, work that would take half an hour in the United States took them 1 day, because they had to clear vegetation that had been spread around by the wind and destruction. Also, the poles that they need for the electric grid, there was a shortage, because they didn't need them just in Puerto Rico. They needed them in Houston, and they needed them in Miami. So even though they would request and requisition the materials, they wouldn't get there as fast as they needed them. So it's almost a year, right? And the new season has started. And although the island is electrified more or less, do we know that this electrification will withstand another hurricane? We have no idea. The Blue Tarp program hasn't, I mean, most of the homes, forget the homes that are destroyed, and there are a lot of those, and not everybody gets money from FEMA for it, because a lot of the paperwork they need to get money is lost in the destruction of the home, and whatever paperwork they can produce is not accepted by FEMA. So you are in a situation that really what the circumstance really is encouraging is more mass exodus towards the United States and abandonment of the island in further disrepair, right? I'm going to skip a little bit.
Systemic challenges.
So this is going to be a little portion. It's from last weekend. PBS did a whole half-an-hour program on Puerto Rico, and it's like a 3-minute update of where we are now in terms of aid and repair to the grid. Yes, Linda?
Just a question about St. Thomas.
Yes.
Okay, which I understand was not as badly devastated as Puerto Rico was, but pretty badly. And my understanding is that while some of the resorts are back, the rest of the island is not.
Yes.
So is it from, they don't have the same rules. I mean, there's not like a Jones Act, I don't think, related to St. Thomas.
No, I mean, but that also is priority for where the industry is, right? I mean, you're going to rebuild where your money is, and I mean, one of the things, if you look at any of the pieces, documentaries, mini, short, or extra long news pieces done by any channel in the last 6 months, San Juan looks almost normal. Some parts of San Juan look almost normal now. It is in the interior of the country where this repair continues, where the work is going to linger for much longer. Parts that are urbanized and populated by the middle class are going to be targeted first, because it's also where the work is easier. In one of the interviews, the governor Rosello says, well, that last mile is the hardest mile. Yeah, it is the hardest mile because it is the most reconstructed corners of Puerto Rico. But definitely the pace of reconstruction is always even. The squeaky wheel will get the grease, right? So it makes sense that the parts of the island, not just in Puerto Rico, but in St. Thomas, that are the source of the economy in terms of tourism, that they would get repaired first. It is unfair that they would get repaired first, but to stand up what is the number one source of earning for the island is important, because that will attract people, and having that money come in will help with the rest. Yeah.
Just a corollary, I don't know if everybody saw, there was an article, I think in the Post, about the 400,000 who fled to Miami, and they're not registering to
Yes,
vote.
I saw that. Although I did see that there was a really,
They're making an attempt at it.
there is a strong debate among voting rights nerds on Twitter about the accuracy of that article. If I find that debate, I will send it. Also, the Latino Decisions polling company that is sort of tracks Latinos, which not all the other companies are very apt at doing, also was questioning some of that data. But it is true that the hope was that these people would come and then they would register to vote and would make a difference in terms of who their representatives would be, and that being here now, they could actually have a voice for Puerto Rico. This issue about registering or not registering, also given that, especially those who are in Florida, given that there are so many hoops that have been created in Florida for registering to vote because of the governor there, it would make sense that they're having a hard time doing that. Yes, Roger.
I was in St. Croix in February, and the recovery there is so much further advanced than in Puerto Rico, and topography makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
St. Croix is relatively flat. I mean, they have some bumps and hills and so on, but it's relatively flat. Okay.
Yep.
I think they also didn't take quite as direct a hit as
Yeah.
Puerto Rico did, but still, the
Yeah.
whole island was really knocked out.
Yeah, I mean, most people who were in Puerto Rico who have been in war zones described it as if a bomb had exploded. I mean, parts of the island that were green the day before looked like the earth had come out, right, from under the ground and exploded all over. And it's only now that all of these parts are now beginning to be covered with green, but you have mountains of metal debris from the destruction all over the island. That has to be shipped and disposed of. Again, the challenges are many. The government has, both the local government and the federal government have advanced in their task of trying to remedy some of these problems. But it is the longest lasting blackout in American history, and the only reason it has been tolerable is because it wasn't in the mainland, it was over there in Puerto Rico, which is a territory, right? So the other thing that Maria has done is sort of reshuffled the priorities for people. If you remember, right before the hurricane hit during the summer, there had been another referendum. We talked a little bit about the status referendums, and you'll see this referendum mentioned on the news all the time about how Puerto Rico overwhelmingly voted for statehood. Yes, 97% of the people who voted for statehood, but only 23% of the population participated in the referendum, because the parties that support independence and Commonwealth did boycotted the referendum. So the only people who participated in the referendum were the people from the party in power right now, and the people who supported statehood. And they got the kind of result you get in a non-democratic setting, 97% of the vote for statehood. In general, as you know, there is this fragmentation in the Puerto Rican population about which option is better. Most of the people who have been polled, and really anecdata, which is not data, it's anecdote, is that there is a souring really with the idea of statehood, a belief that no matter what Puerto Rico does, even if they were to become a state, they would still be treated as second-class citizens. So statehood, if it had 97% support of the people who support statehood, that probably is down a good chunk of a percentage. The idea of the status quo is also, people are very disenchanted, given that because of Promesa and their inability to really do anything about their own economic situation, feels like the Commonwealth Plus, which is what the PDP has been selling for many years, an improved Commonwealth that is not quite statehood but gives them more autonomy, is not believable. And independence is what looks more attractive, otherwise called Brexit by the people, by clever journalists. As I said, I think that there is a fear that remains on the island about the likelihood of independence and the danger or risk that independence would entail, given that that would mean resolving the citizenship issue. What do you do? Does that mean that the people who have been American citizens or Puerto Ricans who live in the United States, do they cease to be citizens? What do we do with that? The fact that the connection to the United States has meant, until they needed it, some level of protection for Puerto Rico. Although again, this aspect, I mean, the thing that took most, the biggest hit was that Puerto Ricans always told themselves this story that when they need that the relationship with the United States was beneficial, not just because they could come here whenever they wanted, but because if they ever needed it, the United States would be there for them. And when they needed it, they really do feel that the United States wasn't there for them, or that when they came dragging their feet and not wanting to be there and complaining about how ungrateful they were being at everything that they were getting. So this question has been reshuffled. Do I think that this reshuffling of opinions and support for the different options will remain? I can't guarantee it. I don't know what will happen. I think that the leadership, even the leadership of those who support statehood, as is the governor of Puerto Rico, Rosello, have been exceedingly disappointed with the government and exceedingly critical of the government, even in terms that you wouldn't expect that party to be. Any questions? No? Yes. Sorry.
Puerto Rico or
Yeah, the American government. Yes.
How do they think they can survive if they have had such a poor economy for so long? They're going to be independent, and no one's going to say, well, forget about your debts.
They could go. I mean, they could go to the World Bank. There's always China. They love investing in Latin America and building infrastructure, and they could take over Vieques or one of the military infrastructures. I mean, there is always a siren song of somebody who would do it better. But at least if they're going to sink, the feeling, I think the overwhelming feeling, I mean, I'm not defending it, but the overwhelming feeling is if we're going to sink, we want to sink by ourselves, right? We want to be able to say, we are going to do X, Y, and Z. We're an economy. We're going to have this citizenship or that citizenship. I mean, it is the feeling that since 2016, they've taken 20 steps steps back politically and economically. Politically, because they're back in a situation in which even decisions that they make at the local level have to be checked and rechecked by this oversight board, in which they don't even have really a voice. Number two, economically, because the country is completely decimated. So is it a solution? I don't know that it's a solution, but it would definitely give them the autonomy that they want. Yes, Linda?
I was just going to say, it seems to me in so many of the issues we talked about, the Jones Act, the tarps having to be made in the U.S., which they're probably none made in the U.S., so many different instances where they could have gone outside and received the support. I mean, people from all over the world help people from all over the world.
Yeah,
when there
in
are
situations
crises.
like this.
But they're trapped in a situation where they can't accept it.
Right. I mean, finally the Jones Act was waived and ships were able to come in, but it was very short-lived, right? And now we have this situation with the tariffs on whatever products are done in Puerto Rico when they're sold here in the United States. I mean, it's really punishing decision-making. Most Puerto Ricans, as you will see in the last thing, they want to solve their own problems. They really do. And if the United States government is not going to step up, then they want it just to get out of the way, right? And I think that is more the feeling. It's less about politics and more about let us fix it, right? And most of at most of the steps, they haven't really been able to do that. Yes, Linda.
They can declare independence?
I mean, again, but for that they would have to agree. And the problem is that there isn't a majority that really agrees on what it is that they want. Even within each group, there is like radical independence, let's have a guerrilla war, and the independents who want a referendum and the United States recognition. And then within the Commonwealth, they want those who want things to stay the same and those who want more autonomy. And then the statehood people. I mean, it really is a really fractured society in terms of ideas. If you read the Trias Monge book, the last 2 chapters, which I posted last week, I think he makes a very persuasive case that this is the case in societies that have been under colonial rule for a really long time. And if you think about Puerto Rico has been under colonial rule since the 16th century. And as if we turn our memory back to our first session and remember the differences between those who wanted one thing or another thing are vis-a-vis Spain, those fractions are exactly the same ones that exist today, except the colonial power is the United States, right? Those divisions in society haven't changed. Not to get biblical, right? But I'm going to anyway. Moses was not allowed to go into the Holy Land because he had the mentality of having been a slave in Egypt. And the idea was that he couldn't go into to live a free life as a new independent nation because he had the mentality of being a slave. And that's not, for me, the lesson here is that there is something about the experience of colonialism that corrupts political decision making to such an extent that it's almost impossible for the political classes to shake that ideology off, because the institutions they have are institutions that are colonial, right? And Trias Monge makes a very convincing case, step by step, that the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States is a colonial decision. It is a colonial relationship. Now, this book was written in the 90s and it was controversial when he wrote it. But any illusion, I think I assigned this piece, any illusion that Puerto Ricans had of American citizenship really was shattered. And this is common to all the groups, right? Their solution might be politically different. but they all feel that their American citizenship was an illusion because of the way things shook up for them. There is a documentary that I didn't send to you. It's made by ABC Australia, and it's about all these techno Bitcoin entrepreneurs coming to Puerto Rico thinking they're going to save Puerto Rico with Bitcoin. And they have all these big plans about everything they're going to do with Bitcoin. So there is a sort of town hall meeting. I will send this documentary to you. There is a town hall meeting, and point out when this is. There is a town hall meeting where the Bitcoin tech gurus are meeting with the people of the community they're trying to save, right? And there's a guy saying, we're going to build something beautiful, and like it or not, you are going to be a part of it. And then, of course, the people say, but why are you saying that you're the one who gets to decide if we like it or not? We're the ones who live here. Who gave you the power to say, like it or not, we're going to build this for you? And that is the kind of attitude that most Puerto Ricans felt, was the condescension and the kind of expectations, projection of sort of stereotypes that were put on them when the hurricane happened. Yes?
What is the likelihood that the Congress and the government would ever allow this to happen? Because my assessment is, your point is, Puerto Rico always was a military fort, and it still is, and it's a U.S. military fort. Now, is China coming in? No way.
Well, I mean, I think that there is a sense in which I think some sectors of both parties would support, for very different ideological reasons, Puerto Rico not being a territory anymore. One for nativist reasons, one group for nativist reasons, and another group for sovereignty reasons, right? So, it could, if they ever got together and decided that that's what they wanted, I could see it happening. The Panama Canal is no longer ours, so that the need for Puerto Rico being an army base, right, is, a fort for the United States is not really relevant anymore. China has been taking over every single infrastructure project in Latin America, and the United States hasn't even batted an eye. Now, taking over a military base would be a little too much, as you say, but I think that there is a likelihood where people from both parties, for different ideological reasons, would support it. Is it likely that it will happen and that they would vote for it right now in Puerto Rico? I do not know. It seems to me that the military imperative of the Cold War is not existent anymore. That would make Puerto Rico a sort of strategically important place for the United States. So I could see it happening. I'm just not betting on it. Yes, and then Carol.
I think generally when people emigrate to the United States, they emigrate and they stay, and there's not a back and forth. But my understanding is that a lot of the Puerto Ricans who live in New York or Florida go back and forth. They still identify as Puerto Rican. So where does that group feel about? I'm going to play a little bit of probably the most famous Puerto Rican, and it's no longer J-Lo. I'm going to play a clip from Lin-Manuel Miranda talking precisely about that. From all the data that I've seen, most Puerto Ricans who come here actually stay here. They go back to the island because they still have family and identify as American and Puerto Rican. But it's like with all immigrant groups, this sort of identity is a negotiation really that happens. It is true
that precisely because they have been here for 2 generations, they were able to deploy their knowledge of the American system in a way that perhaps other communities wouldn't have been able to rally around the island, right, and to try and help the island. Just a second, Carol. Carol.
Okay, there seem to be 2 common detractors to the survival and prospering of Puerto Rico through history. One is human infringement, and it was even before the Spanish, the Caribbean Indians were decimating the native population of Taino Indians, and then the Spanish came in, and things went bad, and we came in, things went bad. But besides foreign populations coming in, the other thing that's been destroying the people, the country, the economy, has been the weather. It's an equal, in some ways, type of villain.
Yeah.
And that is a recurring and very unpredictable effect on everything that goes on there, even down to the basic right to have running water and electricity. Are there any industries that flourish in a harsh, hurricane-prone environment?
Well, I mean,
Could we have FEMA locate there? I have a big industry. Is there
Say
anything
Trump.
that thrives in
well,
that?
I mean, this is the thing. I mean, they hadn't, it's an excellent point. And now, because of the change in our climate patterns, it's probably going to get worse, right? It's every year is going to get worse. Look at the fires happening now. I mean, if you look at how these fires are spreading, I mean, look, we haven't experienced it as much. It's happening in California right now. But if you look at Europe, last year was Portugal, people in cars in the highways dying from wildfires. Same thing in Greece this year. Sweden, Norway, just yesterday I saw that it was spreading in Norway. So we have these climate conditions that are getting much more extreme, and we should expect that to be the case in Puerto Rico. It's an excellent question. What is the model? It sort of ties in with your question. What is the model that Puerto Rico can embrace, given that this is, right, this is what they should plan on, right? It's an island climate. It's in a region where hurricanes are going to be more frequent and more savage in the coming years. And they got lucky that for 100 years, nothing like that happened, right? So everything that was planned, everything that was constructed was on the basis of that luck that nothing bad had ever happened. That pattern is now broken, and they should plan around it. Now, if we start moving away from wherever there are natural disasters, I think we're going to have to move to Mars. At a certain point, they just found water last week. Underground. That's right. Works for me. So, I mean, but it really is a challenge that needs to be addressed. It is why the sort of happy-go-lucky narrative that FEMA fixed the electric grid and now we have 95% electrification in Puerto Rico. Yeah, just in time for a new season of hurricanes. And when they are confronted with this fact and asked, do you think it will survive this new season of hurricanes? They cannot answer, right? Electrification might probably be a better idea to be underground instead of above ground, given the conditions. But because of the topography, that is a challenge. I mean, these are urban planners should put their thinking caps on and think that. And you can see it because of the mass exodus that people don't have confidence in whatever. In things really enduring. But at the same time, there are people who are taking matters into their own hands and fixing things. And I will show you a clip about that. Just a second, Roger. Yes.
I'm confused about what will happen to the people, Puerto Ricans who were in the United States if there was independence.
We have no idea.
Because they're a source of money, and would
Absolutely.
they become like Guatemalans and everybody else who gets deported?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, And given that in previous occasions, when Puerto Ricans wanted to change the terms of engagement with the United States, the negotiating position of the federal government was to punish them. Say, oh, you want to do this? Well, you'll have to pay for this and this and this and that. That has been the negotiating position of the federal government. It wouldn't surprise me that it would mean that all the Puerto Ricans who are here and have been living as Americans for 20 or 30 years would be deemed not Americans anymore and would have to leave. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. But again, it's not an insignificant point. The reason why they have never been able to come to a decision is precisely that there are risks in independence, there are risks in statehood, right? And there are risks in staying in the Commonwealth as they have now. The thing that we didn't have before that we have now is this questioning of the narrative that Puerto Ricans have told themselves, that however bad or unfair or unequal the treatment had been, the fantasy, the fable was, they'll be there for us when they need us, when we need them. And that illusion has disappeared for most Puerto Ricans. Roger, and then I'll just play a clip.
It may be overly simplistic, but if you look at it in a long term, being with the United States or not, compare Puerto Rico and Haiti.
Oh, yeah.
Would you rather be an American Puerto Rican or a Haitian?
Well, but I mean, it is unfair to make that comparison precisely because Haiti was first a French colony and then an American pseudo colony without real colonial status. I mean, obviously we would prefer to be Puerto Rican than to be Haitian because Haiti has gotten the short end of the stick of every colonial relationship it's been in. And then once it liberated itself, it couldn't really get out of the patterns of mismanagement and corruption that had been established. For most Puerto Ricans, this is the answer, that they're going to stay the way they are precisely because of that. But for a certain group, the group here, they say, again, at least we would be making our own mess and somebody else wouldn't be telling us what to do, right? When the earthquake happened in Haiti, everybody came to help, and there are a lot of dysfunctions that happened in Haiti after the recovery, right? But they got to make their own decisions. They got to have their own elections. They got to point the finger at the people that they wanted to point the finger at, right? Puerto Ricans don't get to do that. And the people who support independence, for them, that is the root of the problem, that they never get to point the finger at anybody because they don't have a voice to do that, right?